The widow Zelda Gardner stood in the general store of Utica, Montana Territory, on a cool September morning in 1883, watching the young woman behind the counter try not to laugh at her request for a new dress pattern meant for courting. She was 42 years old, and apparently that was ancient in the eyes of most folks in this dusty cattle town, where youth seemed to be the only currency worth trading. The snickers from the two ranch wives browsing fabric bolts nearby confirmed what Zelda had suspected since her husband Henry died 3 years ago. Nobody expected her to find love again, and they thought her foolish for hoping. "Mrs. Gardner, surely you mean this is for your daughter?" The young clerk, barely 20 if she was a day, held up the pattern with a condescending smile that made Zelda's cheeks burn. "I don't have a daughter, Miss Peterson, as you well know." Zelda kept her voice steady despite the humiliation crawling up her spine. "I'll take that pattern, along with 3 yards of the blue calico." The two women at the fabric table didn't even bother hiding their amusement now. Martha Flynn, the banker's wife, whispered something to her companion that ended with mutton dressed as lamb, and they both dissolved into giggles. Zelda had heard it all before. Too old, too plain, too weathered by prairie winds and hard living. A widow should know her place, should fade quietly into the background, should tend her small garden and be grateful for church charity. But Zelda Gardner had never been good at doing what she was supposed to do. She paid for her purchases with as much dignity as she could muster and walked out into the bright Montana sunshine, her parcels tucked under her arm. The September air carried the scent of hay and horses, dust and distant pine forests. Utica wasn't much to look at, just a handful of buildings clustered along a rutted main street, but it sat in a valley surrounded by rolling grassland that turned golden this time of year. The Little Belt Mountains rose in the distance, purple and mysterious against the endless blue sky. Zelda climbed into her small wagon, flicked the reins over her old mare's back, and started the 5-mile journey back to her late husband's homestead. Henry had claimed a modest 160 acres under the Homestead Act back in 1876, and they'd worked themselves nearly to death trying to make it produce. He died of pneumonia during a brutal winter, leaving her with a paid-for piece of land, a small herd of cattle, and a profound loneliness that seemed to grow heavier with each passing season. The laughter from the general store still rang in her ears as the wagon bumped along the rough road. Maybe they were right. Maybe at 42 she should accept that her life was essentially over, that the best years were behind her. But something stubborn in her heart refused to believe it. She still woke each morning with hope. She still looked at herself in the small mirror above her wash basin and saw a woman who had plenty of living left to do. Her dark hair, though streaked with gray, was still thick. Her brown eyes still sparkled when something amused her. She'd kept her figure despite years of hard work, and she had all her teeth, which was more than many people could say at her age. Lost in thought, Zelda almost didn't notice the rider approaching from the opposite direction until he was nearly upon her. She pulled her mare to a stop as the man on the big chestnut gelding tipped his hat to her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that suggested he was somewhere in his 40s as well. His eyes, she noticed, were a startling shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains. "Madam," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. "I wonder if you could direct me to the Edmund ranch. I was told it was along this road, but I seem to have missed it." The Edmund place. Zelda shifted the reins in her hands, studying the stranger. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. His clothes were dusty from travel but well made, and his boots, though worn, had been expensive once. You pass the turnoff about a mile back. There's a lightning-struck cottonwood at the corner. You can't miss it if you're looking for it. Much obliged." He didn't immediately ride off, and Zelda found herself caught in his steady gaze. "I'm Lucas Edmund. That ranch belonged to my uncle and I've just inherited it. Came all the way from Wyoming to see what he left me." "I'm sorry for your loss," Zelda said automatically, though she remembered old Thomas Edmund as a cantankerous hermit who'd rarely come to town and had died alone in his cabin last spring. The ranch had sat empty all summer while lawyers tracked down his heir. "I'm Mrs. Gardner. My property borders yours on the eastern side. Then I suppose we'll be neighbors." Lucas Edmund smiled, and the expression transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made Zelda's heart skip in a way she hadn't felt in years. "I hope that sits well with you, Mrs. Gardner." "I suppose time will tell, Mr. Edmund." She kept her tone neutral, though something about this man's direct gaze made her feel like a girl again. "Welcome to Utica." She flicked the reins and continued on her way, acutely aware that Lucas Edmund sat on his horse watching her go. She resisted the urge to look back, kept her spine straight and her eyes forward, but her mind was spinning. A new neighbor. A man close to her own age if she was any judge. A man who'd looked at her without pity or condescension, just straightforward interest. "Don't be a fool," she told herself sternly. "You just came from being laughed at in town. The last thing you need is to start spinning fantasies about a stranger." But that night, as she sat alone in her small cabin with the oil lamp burning low, she found herself thinking about storm cloud eyes and a voice like distant thunder. She thought about the way Lucas Edmund had smiled at her, as if she were someone worth smiling at. And for the first time in weeks, she went to bed with something other than loneliness keeping her company. The next 2 weeks passed in the usual rhythm of ranch work. Zelda tended her small herd, repaired fence where the posts had rotted, put up the last of her garden vegetables for winter. She saw smoke rising from the Edmund place occasionally and knew her new neighbor was settling in, but their paths didn't cross. She told herself she wasn't disappointed. She had work to do, and mooning over a man like some foolish girl would only lead to heartache. Then one bright afternoon in early October, she was riding her fence line checking for breaks when she spotted a calf on the wrong side of the barbed wire, bawling for its mother. The cow stood on Zelda's side of the fence, growing increasingly agitated, and the calf was too stupid to find the gap it had clearly squeezed through earlier. As Zelda dismounted to help, she noticed the brand on the calf's flank. The Edmund brand, which old Thomas had registered years ago. She was trying to coax the calf back through the fence when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the Edmund side. Lucas rode up on his chestnut gelding, taking in the situation with a quick glance. "Looks like one of mine caused you trouble," he said, swinging down from the saddle with an easy grace. "I appreciate you not leaving him for the wolves. I wouldn't do that to any creature, let alone a neighbor's stock." Zelda stepped back as Lucas approached the calf, which naturally skittered away from him and promptly found the gap in the fence, squeezing through to its anxious mother. They both stared at the reunited pair for a moment, then laughed. "I've been meaning to ride over and introduce myself properly," Lucas said, turning to face her. In the afternoon sunlight, Zelda could see the gray threading through his dark hair, the fine lines around his eyes. He had a strong face, honest and open. "Haven't had much time. The place was in worse shape than I expected." "Your uncle wasn't much for upkeep in his later years," Zelda admitted. "I'm sorry to speak ill of the dead, but Thomas Edmund was stubborn as they come, wouldn't accept help from anyone." "Sounds like my family, all right." Lucas's expression was wry. "Stubbornness runs deep in the Edmund line. but I'm hoping to be a better neighbor than my uncle was. Speaking of which, I was planning to ride into town tomorrow for supplies. I wonder if you might need anything hauled out. I've got a wagon, and it seems foolish for both of us to make the trip separately." Zelda hesitated. The offer was practical and neighborly, nothing more, but she knew what the town gossips would make of it if she rode into Utica sitting beside Lucas Edmund. Then again, she thought with a flash of defiance, they were already laughing at her. What difference did it make? "That's kind of you, Mr. Edmund. I do have a list that needs filling, and if we're going to be neighbors, you might as well call me Zelda." "Only if you call me Lucas." His smile was warm and genuine. "I'll come by your place tomorrow morning, say around 8. I'll be ready." She rode home with a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was just the pleasure of friendly company. Maybe it was something more. Either way, she allowed herself to feel hopeful, and that alone seemed like a small victory. The next morning, Zelda rose early and put on her second-best dress, the dark green one that Henry had always said brought out her eyes. She braided her hair and pinned it up neatly, then looked at herself in the mirror and felt a moment of doubt. Who was she fooling? The years showed in her face no matter what dress she wore or how carefully she arranged her hair. But then she remembered Lucas's smile, the way he'd looked at her without judgment, and she lifted her chin. She had as much right to try as anyone. Lucas arrived promptly at 8, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by a matched pair of bay horses. He climbed down and tipped his hat to her, his eyes taking in her appearance with what looked like appreciation. "You look very nice, Zelda," he said simply, and the compliment, delivered without fanfare or exaggeration, warmed her more than flowery words would have. "Thank you, Lucas. I appreciate you making this trip." He helped her up onto the wagon seat with a steady hand, and they set off toward town. The morning air was crisp and cool, perfect autumn weather, and the grassland stretched golden on either side of the road. For the first few miles, they rode in comfortable silence, but gradually they began to talk. Lucas told her about his life in Wyoming, where he'd worked as a ranch foreman for a wealthy cattleman. He'd never married, he said, because the work had consumed all his time and energy. "I turned 45 this past summer," he said, his eyes on the road ahead. "Started thinking about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. Then the lawyer's letter came about Uncle Thomas dying and leaving me his place. Seemed like a sign, you know. Time to stop working for other men's dreams and build something of my own." "I know something about starting over," Zelda said. "When Henry died, everyone expected me to sell the homestead and move back east. I'm from Ohio originally. But I'd put too much of myself into that land to just walk away from it, even if it means being alone." "Does it have to mean being alone?" Lucas asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. Zelda's heart hammered in her chest. Before she could formulate an answer, they crested a rise, and Utica came into view below them. The moment passed, but the question remained, echoing in Zelda's mind. They drove down Utica's main street, and Zelda was immediately aware of heads turning, of people stopping their conversations to stare. Lucas seemed oblivious to the attention as he pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and set the brake. He came around to help Zelda down, and she caught sight of Martha Flynn standing outside the mercantile, her mouth hanging open in undisguised shock. "Zelda Gardner, as I live and breathe," Martha called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of false sweetness that women use when they're about to say something cutting. "I see you've wasted no time setting your cap at the new rancher. Though I suppose at your age you can't afford to wait, can you?" Zelda felt the familiar burn of humiliation start in her chest, but before she could respond, Lucas stepped forward. His expression was pleasant enough, but his voice carried an edge of steel. "I'm sorry, madam, but I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Lucas Edmund, and I should tell you that I was the one who sought out Mrs. Gardner's company, not the other way around. She was kind enough to share her knowledge of the area with a newcomer. If you're implying something improper about a simple neighborly arrangement, then I have to question your manners, not hers." Martha's face went from pale to red in an instant. She sputtered something incoherent and retreated into the mercantile, leaving Lucas and Zelda standing on the boardwalk. Zelda looked up at him, surprised and touched by his defense of her. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did." Lucas met her eyes steadily. "I won't stand by and let people speak cruelly to you, Zelda, not when you've shown me nothing but kindness." They went about their shopping, and Zelda noticed that Lucas stayed close to her side, his presence a solid comfort. When they passed other townspeople, he greeted them politely and introduced himself, always making it clear that he held Zelda in high regard. By the time they loaded their purchases into the wagon, the gossip mill was surely running at full speed, but Zelda found she didn't care as much as she had before. On the ride back, Lucas seemed thoughtful. Finally, as they neared the turnoff to his property, he spoke. "Can I ask you something personal, Zelda?" "You can ask. I might not answer, but you can ask." "Why do you let them treat you that way? Those women in town. You're clearly a good person, hardworking and decent. Why do you let them make you feel small?" Zelda was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. "I suppose it's because part of me believes they're right, that I am too old to be thinking about things like romance or new beginnings, that I should just accept my lot and be grateful for what I have." "And what do you have?" "A roof over my head, food on my table. My health, mostly. Some people would say that's enough." "Is it enough for you?" The question hit her square in the chest. She looked at Lucas, really looked at him, and saw a man who was asking her something important. Not just about what she had, but what she wanted. "No," she admitted, the word barely more than a whisper. "No, it's not enough." Lucas pulled the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the road. He turned to face her fully, his gray-blue eyes intense. "I'm going to tell you something, Zelda Gardner, and I want you to listen carefully. I've been praying for years for something I thought I'd never find. A woman with strength and courage. A woman who knows what hard work means, who won't break when life gets difficult. A woman who's lived enough to know what really matters. I've been praying for a partner, not some young girl who sees me as a means to security or adventure. I want someone real, someone tested by life and still standing." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "You're exactly what I prayed for, Zelda. Exactly. The fact that you're 42 instead of 22 doesn't make you less valuable. It makes you more valuable. So please, please stop listening to those small-minded people who think youth is the only thing worth having. They're wrong, and I think you know it." Tears stung Zelda's eyes. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Not even Henry, dear as he'd been, had made her feel like she was something precious just as she was, weathered and worn by life but still worthy. "Lucas, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me court you properly. Say you'll give me a chance to prove that what I'm feeling is real." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I know it's fast. I know we've barely known each other 3 weeks, but I'm old enough to know when something feels right, and this feels right to me. If you need time, I'll wait. If you want to go slow, we'll go slow. But please don't shut me out because you think you're too old to deserve happiness." Zelda looked into his earnest face and felt something break open inside her chest, some hard shell of defense and resignation that she'd built up over the years. What poured out was a flood of feeling so strong it almost frightened her. Hope and fear and longing all mixed together. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. "Yes, I'll let you court me. I want that. I want it more than I can say." Lucas's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so sweet and old-fashioned that it made her heart ache. "You've made me very happy, Zelda. I promise you won't regret this." They continued on to her property, and when Lucas helped her down from the wagon, he held her a moment longer than necessary, his hands on her waist, his eyes searching hers. "Can I come calling on Sunday?" he asked. "I'll bring lunch and we can sit on your porch and talk, get to know each other better." "I'd like that very much." He lingered a moment more, then reluctantly released her and climbed back onto the wagon. Zelda watched him drive away, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating like a wild thing. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Sunday dawned clear and bright, and Zelda spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation. She cleaned her small cabin until everything shone, changed her dress 3 times, and finally settled on the blue calico she'd made from the fabric she bought the day Martha Flynn had laughed at her. It seemed fitting somehow. A small act of defiance transformed into something hopeful. Lucas arrived at noon carrying a basket that smelled of fried chicken and fresh bread. He'd shaved and put on a clean shirt, and the sight of him making an effort for her sake made Zelda's throat tighten with emotion. They sat on her small porch in the 2 chairs Henry had made years ago, the basket between them, and talked for hours. Lucas told her about growing up in a big family in Wyoming, the youngest of 5 brothers. He'd left home at 16 to make his own way, working on various ranches across the territory. He talked about the loneliness of that life, the way years could slip past without much to show for them, except calluses and saddle sores. Zelda told him about her childhood in Ohio, the daughter of a shopkeeper who died when she was young. She'd married Henry when she was 21, and they'd headed west full of dreams about making a fortune. The reality had been much harder than the dream, but they'd been happy together in their way. She spoke honestly about her marriage, about how she and Henry had been friends and partners more than grand passion, but that it had been enough. She'd mourned him genuinely when he died, but she'd also felt a strange sense of freedom, as if she'd been released to discover who she was outside of being someone's wife. "I think that's why the women in town bother me so much," she admitted as the afternoon shadows grew long. "They want me to disappear into widowhood, to become invisible. But I feel like I'm just starting to figure out who Zelda Gardner actually is, separate from anyone else." "And who is she?" Lucas asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. "I'm still discovering that," Zelda said with a small smile. "But I know she's someone who wants more than just survival. She wants joy. She wants adventure, even if it's small adventures. She wants to feel alive." "I want those things too," Lucas said quietly. "I've spent so long just existing, just working to get through each day. When I got that letter about inheriting the ranch, it felt like God was giving me a second chance. A chance to build something that matters. And then I met you, and I started thinking maybe that something wasn't just a ranch. Maybe it was a life, a real life with someone to share it." He reached across and took her hand, and they sat like that for a while, fingers intertwined, watching the sun paint the grasslands gold and orange. When Lucas finally left as dusk settled over the valley, he kissed her hand again, and Zelda thought she might float away with happiness. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that felt both thrilling and comfortable. Lucas came calling twice a week, and they took to riding the boundary between their properties together, discussing how they might help each other with the heavy work that fall demanded. Lucas suggested they could share equipment and labor, pool their resources for things like hay cutting and cattle drives. It made practical sense, but Zelda knew there was more to it than practicality. They were weaving their lives together, strand by strand. The town's reaction to their courtship ranged from scandalized to amused. Martha Flynn and her crowd maintained that Zelda was making a fool of herself, but Zelda noticed that their criticism had lost its sting. When you had someone like Lucas looking at you the way he looked at her, someone who saw value in your years rather than shame, the opinions of small-minded gossips didn't matter much. There were others in Utica who were kinder. The doctor's wife, a practical woman named Helen who'd always treated Zelda decently, stopped her outside the church one Sunday and said, "I think it's wonderful what you and Mr. Edmund have found. Don't let the biddies get you down. You deserve happiness as much as anyone." That simple encouragement meant more to Zelda than she could express. As October turned to November, the weather grew colder, and Lucas started talking about the future in more concrete terms. One evening, as they sat by the fire in Zelda's cabin, their first time truly alone together inside rather than out on the porch or riding the range, he took both her hands in his and looked at her with such seriousness that her breath caught. "Zelda, I know we haven't been courting long by conventional standards, but we're not exactly conventional people, are we? We've both lived enough to know what we want, and I know what I want. I want you. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to work beside you every day. I want to build something together, not just two separate ranches, but a real home, a real partnership." He slid off the chair and onto one knee, and Zelda's heart stopped. "I'm not a rich man, and I can't promise you an easy life. But I can promise you that I will love you and respect you and stand beside you for whatever time we have left on this earth. Zelda Gardner, will you marry me?" Zelda looked down at him, this good man who'd seen past her age and her weathered hands and her gray-streaked hair to the woman underneath. This man who defended her to gossips and made her feel valuable and desired. This man who'd been, as he said, exactly what she'd been praying for without even knowing she was praying. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Lucas, I'll marry you." He stood and pulled her into his arms, and when he kissed her for the first time, it was tender and sweet and full of promise. Zelda felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears, joyful tears, the kind that wash away years of loneliness and grief. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Utica on a cold November day. The guest list was small, mostly because Zelda had few close friends in town, but the people who came were the ones who mattered. Helen and her husband, the doctor, stood as witnesses. A few neighboring ranchers who'd gotten to know Lucas came and wished them well. And yes, Martha Flynn was there too, sitting in the back pew with her mouth pinched tight, but Zelda barely noticed her. All she saw was Lucas standing at the front of the church in his best suit, his eyes shining as she walked down the aisle toward him. The minister, an elderly man who'd been kind to Zelda after Henry died, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. When he pronounced them husband and wife and Lucas kissed her in front of God and everyone, Zelda felt like she was beginning an entirely new life. They spent their wedding night at Lucas's ranch, which had become much more livable in the months he'd been working on it. He'd repaired the roof, chinked the gaps in the walls, built new furniture to replace his uncle's broken pieces. He carried her over the threshold like she was a young bride, and Zelda laughed with pure delight at the gesture. What happened in the privacy of their bedroom that night was tender and passionate, and everything Zelda had hoped for. Lucas treated her like she was precious, his hands and lips worshipful as they learned each other's bodies. Zelda had worried that at her age, with all the changes time had wrought, she wouldn't be desirable, but Lucas proved those fears groundless. He loved her thoroughly and completely, And afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Zelda felt more beautiful than she ever had in her youth. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I didn't think I'd ever say those words again to anyone, but I love you, Lucas Edmund." "I love you too, Zelda Edmund," he murmured against her hair. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." The first months of their marriage were an adjustment, as any marriage is, but the foundation of respect and genuine affection they'd built during their courtship served them well. They decided to live primarily at Lucas's ranch, which was larger and in better condition, but they kept Zelda's original homestead and used it for storage and extra grazing land. Combining their herds gave them a more sustainable operation, and Lucas's experience as a ranch foreman meant he knew how to manage cattle efficiently. Winter came hard that year, with deep snows and bitter cold that kept them close to home for weeks at a time. But Zelda found she didn't mind being snowed in with Lucas. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking and reading aloud to each other, playing cards and making plans for the spring. On the coldest nights, they stayed in bed late, wrapped in quilts and each other's arms, finding warmth in intimacy and companionship. It was during one of those long winter nights that Zelda first mentioned something that had been on her mind. "Lucas, I know I'm past the age where most women have children. I'm 43 now, and the chances of me conceiving are slim. I just want you to know that if you hoped for children, I might not be able to give you that." Lucas pulled her closer, his hand stroking her hair. "Zelda, I married you for you, not for some theoretical children. If God blesses us with a baby, that would be wonderful. If not, we have each other, and that's more than enough." But God, it seemed, had other plans. In late February, Zelda started feeling queasy in the mornings. At first, she thought it was something she ate, but when the nausea continued and her monthly courses didn't come, she began to wonder. A visit to the doctor in March confirmed what she'd hardly dared to hope. "You're with child, Mrs. Edmund," the doctor said with a smile. "Probably about 2 months along, I'd say. Due sometime in late September or early October." Zelda rode home in a daze, her hand pressed to her still flat belly. A baby, at 43. It seemed impossible, miraculous, terrifying. What would people say? Would they laugh at her for being pregnant at her age? Would they say cruel things about her child? But when she told Lucas that evening, his reaction swept away all her fears. He whooped with joy, picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down carefully as if she might break. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you sure you're happy about this?" Zelda asked, needing to be certain. "I know it's unexpected and I'm not a young woman. The pregnancy might be difficult and people are going to talk." "Let them talk," Lucas said fiercely. "This is a blessing, Zelda, a pure blessing. And yes, I'm sure I'm happy. I'm more than happy. I'm grateful beyond words." He pulled her into his arms and held her close, and Zelda let herself believe in the miracle growing inside her. The pregnancy was not easy. Zelda's body, while still strong, struggled with the demands of carrying a child at her age. She tired easily and had to rest more than she wanted to. True to her fears, the gossips in town had a field day with the news. She heard through Helen that Martha Flynn had declared it unseemly for a woman of Zelda's age to be in a family way, as if there were some cut-off point after which God wasn't allowed to bless people with children. But for every cruel word, there was also unexpected kindness. Several of the ranch wives, women who'd never paid much attention to Zelda before, stopped by with gifts for the baby and advice about pregnancy. Helen became a regular visitor, checking on Zelda's health and offering encouragement. Even the minister's wife, a quiet woman named Sarah, brought by a beautifully crocheted blanket and told Zelda that children were a gift from God at any age. Lucas was attentive to the point of being overprotective. He insisted Zelda rest more, took over most of the heavy chores, and fretted over every twinge or pain she mentioned. It was sweet, but sometimes suffocating, and they had their first real argument when Zelda insisted on helping with the spring branding. "You're 6 months pregnant, Zelda. You can't be out there with the cattle in this heat." "I'm pregnant, not an invalid. Women have been having babies and working right up until delivery since the beginning of time." They stood in the kitchen, facing each other with stubborn determination, until finally Lucas's shoulders sagged. "I'm just scared," he admitted quietly. "I'm scared something will happen to you or the baby. I couldn't bear it if I lost you." Zelda's anger melted away. She went to him and took his hands. "I'm scared too, but fear can't rule our lives, Lucas. I promise I'll be careful. I promise I won't do anything foolish. But I need to be useful. I need to still be me, not just a fragile vessel carrying a baby." They reached a compromise. Zelda could help with lighter tasks but would stay away from the actual branding and roping. It wasn't perfect, but it was a solution they could both live with. And Zelda learned something important. Marriage wasn't about always getting your way, but about finding middle ground where both people felt heard and valued. Summer progressed, and Zelda's belly swelled. By August, she felt huge and ungainly, her back aching constantly and her feet swelling in the heat. Lucas rubbed her feet every night and told her she was beautiful, even when she felt like a beached whale. His steadfast love and support got her through the difficult last weeks. On a clear September night, just as the aspens started turning gold on the mountainsides, Zelda's labor began. Lucas rode to town through the darkness to fetch the doctor and Helen, who'd agreed to serve as midwife. The hours that followed were brutal and exhausting, Zelda's body straining to do what younger women's bodies managed more easily. There were moments when she thought she couldn't go on, when the pain was too much and the effort too great. But Lucas stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement. And when dawn broke over the Montana grasslands and their son finally slipped into the world with a lusty cry, Zelda thought her heart might burst with joy. "A boy," the doctor announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant on Zelda's chest. "A healthy baby boy." Lucas was crying openly, his face wet with tears as he looked at his wife and child. "He's perfect. You're perfect. Thank you, Zelda, thank you." They named him Thomas, after Lucas's uncle, with the middle name Henry after Zelda's first husband. It felt right to honor the past while celebrating the future. Little Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong despite all the worries about Zelda's age. He had his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and from the beginning, he was clearly the center of their world. The first year of Thomas's life was exhausting but joyful. Zelda, who'd never thought she'd experience motherhood, threw herself into it with fierce dedication. She nursed him and rocked him and sang the lullabies her own mother had sung to her. Lucas was a devoted father, getting up in the night to walk with Thomas when he was fussy, playing with him on the floor, carrying him around the ranch to show him the cattle and horses. They were a family, complete and happy, and when Zelda caught her reflection in the mirror, she saw not an aging woman past her prime but a mother, a wife, a woman living a full and purposeful life. The gray in her hair didn't seem like a mark of shame anymore, but a badge of experience, proof that she'd lived and survived and grown strong enough to handle whatever came. On Thomas's first birthday, they had a small celebration at the ranch. Helen and the doctor came, along with Sarah, the minister's wife, and a few neighboring families. Even Martha Flynn showed up, though whether from genuine goodwill or curiosity, Zelda couldn't tell. but she welcomed them all graciously because she'd learned that her happiness didn't depend on anyone else's approval. As the guests mingled and Thomas smeared cake all over his face, Lucas came up behind Zelda and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Happy," he murmured in her ear. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," she said honestly. "Thank you for seeing past what everyone else saw. Thank you for seeing me." "You were exactly what I prayed for," Lucas said, repeating the words he'd spoken that day on the road over a year ago. And every day since has only confirmed that truth. They stood together watching their son play, surrounded by the life they'd built together, and Zelda marveled at how much could change in such a short time. 2 years ago, she'd been a lonely widow convinced her best days were behind her. Now she was a wife and mother, loved and valued, living proof that it was never too late for happiness. The years that followed were full of the normal ups and downs of ranch life. There were good years when the cattle brought decent prices and bad years when drought or harsh winters took their toll. There were moments of fear, like when Thomas, at age 3, wandered off, and they spent hours searching before finding him asleep in the hayloft. There were moments of joy, like the first time Thomas rode a horse by himself, his little face alight with pride. When Thomas was 4, Zelda discovered she was pregnant again. At 47, it seemed even more impossible than the first time, and the pregnancy was harder. She spent most of the last 3 months on bed rest, frustrated and worried. But Lucas and Thomas took care of her, bringing her meals and keeping her company. And in the spring of 1889, she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose. Rose was tiny and fierce, with her father's determination and her mother's stubbornness. She kept them all on their toes from the moment she could crawl. Thomas adored his baby sister, and Zelda often found him reading to her or showing her his treasures, pebbles and feathers and bits of things he thought were important. As the children grew, Lucas and Zelda grew older too, but they grew older together, which made all the difference. Zelda's hair turned completely gray, and her face gained more lines. Lucas's shoulders grew stiffer, and his hands developed arthritis. But they still looked at each other with love and desire, still reached for each other in the night, still chose each other every day. The ranch prospered under their joint management. They never became wealthy, but they built something solid and sustainable, a legacy to pass on to their children. They added onto the house, creating more bedrooms and a proper parlor. They improved their herd, invested in better breeding stock, built relationships with buyers in Helena and beyond. By the time Thomas turned 10, he was already a capable ranch hand, able to rope and ride and handle cattle with the skill of someone much older. Rose, at 6, was proving to be fearless, more interested in working outside with the men than learning domestic skills inside with her mother. Zelda let her be who she was, remembering her own struggles against the limitations people tried to put on women. One evening in the summer of 1893, after the children had been put to bed, Lucas and Zelda sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Lucas reached over and took Zelda's hand, his thumb rubbing across her knuckles in a gesture that had become familiar over the years. "I was thinking today about the first time I saw you," he said quietly, "driving that wagon down the road, looking so determined and capable. I remember thinking that you were exactly the kind of woman I'd always hoped to find, strong and real and unafraid of hard work." "I was afraid of plenty," Zelda said with a soft laugh. "I was afraid I'd die alone and lonely. Afraid that everyone was right and I was past the age for love and happiness." "I'm glad you were wrong. Me too." She squeezed his hand. "You know what I remember? I remember you defending me to Martha Flynn that day in town, No one had ever stood up for me like that before. You made me feel like I mattered, like I was worth defending. That's when I started to fall in love with you. Just started, Lucas teased gently. Well, the process was complete pretty quickly after that, Zelda admitted. Especially after you told me I was exactly what you'd prayed for. Those words changed everything for me, Lucas. They gave me permission to believe in myself again, to believe I deserved good things. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the evening air cooling around them, the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night familiar and soothing. We should take a trip, Lucas said suddenly. Maybe next summer when the kids are a little older. I'd like to show you Wyoming, where I grew up. And maybe we could go further, see some of the places we've only heard about. Denver, maybe, or even San Francisco. That sounds wonderful, Zelda said, though part of her couldn't quite imagine leaving the ranch that had become so central to her life. But the idea of adventure, of seeing new things with Lucas by her side, appealed to the part of her that had never quite settled into contentment, that still longed for more. As the years continued to pass, they did take that trip and others. They showed their children the wider world beyond their Montana valley, teaching them that there was value in both staying rooted and exploring beyond your boundaries. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who loved the ranch and wanted nothing more than to continue building on what his parents had created. Rose remained wild and independent, talking about becoming a teacher or maybe even a doctor, dreams that would have been impossible for a woman of Zelda's generation, but seemed within reach for a girl born in the 1880s. By 1900, Lucas and Zelda had been married for nearly 15 years. Zelda was 58, Lucas was 60, and they moved a little slower than they once had. But the love between them had only deepened with time, tempered by shared struggles and sweetened by shared joys. They knew each other completely, the good and bad, the strong and weak, and they loved each other anyway. Maybe even because of those imperfections rather than in spite of them. One winter evening, with snow falling softly outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, their children asleep upstairs, Lucas pulled Zelda onto his lap in the big chair by the fire. She laughed and protested that they were too old for such nonsense, but she settled against him anyway, her head on his shoulder. "You ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Marrying me instead of some younger woman who could have given you more years, more children?" "Never," Lucas said firmly. "Not once, not for a moment. You gave me everything I needed, Zelda. A real partnership, real love, 2 beautiful children, a home that actually feels like home instead of just a place to sleep between working. How could I regret any of that?" "I just want to make sure you're happy," Zelda said. "That you don't feel like you missed out on anything." Lucas tilted her face up so he could look into her eyes. "Listen to me, Zelda Edmund. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. If I could go back in time and choose any path, I would choose this one, choose you, every single time. The years we've had together are worth more than a lifetime with anyone else could have been. Do you understand?" Zelda nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. After all these years, he still knew how to make her feel cherished and valuable. He still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, even though her face was lined and her hair was white and her body bore the marks of age and childbearing. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much it sometimes scares me. I think about how close I came to giving up, to believing I wasn't worthy of this, and it terrifies me." "But you didn't give up," Lucas said, kissing her forehead gently. "You were brave enough to take a chance, brave enough to ignore the people who tried to make you feel small. And that bravery gave us this life." They sat together in the firelight, holding each other, grateful for the unexpected second chance they'd both been given. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in white. But inside there was only warmth and love and the deep contentment that comes from a life well lived with someone who truly sees you. As the new century dawned, bringing with it changes and challenges neither of them could fully anticipate, Lucas and Zelda faced it together. Thomas was 15 now, already talking about taking over more responsibility on the ranch. Rose was 11, fierce and bright and determined to make her mark on the world. The ranch was stable and prosperous, a testament to years of hard work and careful management. One spring morning in 1901, Zelda woke early and slipped out of bed without waking Lucas. She walked out onto the porch in her nightgown and wrapper, watching the sun rise over the grasslands she'd come to love so deeply. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of new grass and wildflowers. Birds sang their morning songs, and in the distance, she could hear the cattle lowing. She thought about the woman she'd been when she first came to this valley all those years ago with Henry. Young and hopeful, but also naive, unprepared for how hard life could be. She thought about the widow she'd been, convinced her life was essentially over, that the best she could hope for was quiet survival. And she thought about who she was now. A wife and mother, a rancher, a woman who'd learned that age was not a barrier to love or happiness or new beginnings. Lucas came out and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, standing behind her with his arms around her waist. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Just wanted to watch the sunrise," Zelda said, "and think about how grateful I am for all of this, for you." "I'm the grateful one," Lucas murmured. "You're exactly what I prayed for, Zelda. Then, now, always." She turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into that kiss. They stood there on the porch as the sun climbed higher. Two people who'd found each other against the odds, who'd built something beautiful and lasting out of loneliness and hope. The years continued to roll by, as years do. Thomas married a sweet girl from a neighboring ranch when he was 21, and they built a small house on the Edmund property, planning to eventually take over the main ranch. Rose went off to teachers' college in Helena, fulfilling her dream of getting an education and making her own way in the world. She wrote letters home full of enthusiasm and ideas, and Zelda read them with pride, knowing that her daughter would never have to feel limited by her gender the way Zelda's generation had. Lucas and Zelda grew older, their bodies slowing down but their spirits still vibrant. They handed over more and more of the ranch work to Thomas and his wife, spending their days in quieter pursuits. Lucas took up woodworking and made beautiful furniture that he gave to their children and grandchildren. Zelda, her eyesight failing but her mind still sharp, became known throughout the valley for her wisdom and kindness, and people often came to her for advice. The gossips who'd once mocked her for thinking she could find love at her age were mostly gone now, dead or moved away or simply no longer relevant. Martha Flynn had passed away in 1905, and Zelda had attended her funeral and forgiven her all the cruel words, because holding on to bitterness only poisoned your own heart. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1908, their children threw them a party at the ranch. Thomas and his wife were there with their 3 children, Zelda and Lucas's grandchildren. Rose came home from Helena, where she now taught at a school for girls. Neighbors from all over the valley attended, people who'd watched Lucas and Zelda build their life together and respected what they'd accomplished. As Zelda looked around at the gathered crowd, at the life she and Lucas had created, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. All the pain and loneliness of her earlier years seemed distant now, like a bad dream that had given way to a beautiful reality. She'd been 42, and convinced her life was over when Lucas had ridden into her world and shown her that the best was yet to come. Lucas found her standing alone for a moment, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, and he slipped his hand into hers. "Happy anniversary, my love," he said softly. 25 years, Zelda marveled. Where did the time go? "Into building this," Lucas said, gesturing at the ranch, the family, the gathered friends. "Into building us. I wouldn't change a moment of it." "Neither would I," Zelda said. She looked up at her husband, this man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, who defended her and loved her and stood by her through everything life had thrown at them. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, his body bent with age and hard work. But to her, he was still the handsome stranger on the chestnut horse, still the man who'd made her heart skip with a single smile. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for choosing me, for seeing me, for loving me exactly as I am." "Thank you for being brave enough to let me," Lucas replied. He pulled her close and kissed her, not caring who was watching, and Zelda kissed him back with all the love in her heart. As the party continued around them, music and laughter filling the air, Zelda and Lucas stood together. Two people who'd found each other in the wild country of Montana Territory and built a love that had lasted through seasons and storms, through joy and sorrow, through all the challenges that life could offer. They'd proven that it was never too late for love, never too late for new beginnings, never too late to become exactly who you were meant to be. The years that followed their anniversary were slower and quieter, but no less full of love. Lucas's health began to fail gradually, his heart growing weaker, but he remained cheerful and grateful for every day. Zelda cared for him tenderly, returning the devotion he'd shown her through all their years together. They spent long afternoons sitting together, sometimes talking, sometimes just holding hands in comfortable silence, content in each other's presence. Lucas passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1911, with Zelda beside him. He was 71 years old, and they'd been married for 26 years. Zelda mourned him deeply, but not with the desperate grief she might have felt as a younger woman. Instead, her grief was tempered with gratitude for the years they'd shared, for the love they'd built, for the family and legacy they'd created together. She lived on at the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and became the matriarch of a growing family. Thomas ran the ranch with skill and dedication, honoring his father's memory by caring well for the land and animals they'd worked so hard to build. Rose continued teaching and eventually married another educator, a kind man who supported her independence and encouraged her work. Zelda lived to see the end of the wild frontier, the closing of open ranges, the coming of automobiles and telephones and all manner of modern conveniences. She lived through a world war and saw women finally gain the right to vote, a victory she celebrated with tears of joy, thinking of all the women like her who'd been told they were too old, too plain, too unremarkable to matter. On her 80th birthday in 1921, surrounded by 3 generations of family, Zelda looked back on her long life with satisfaction. She'd survived 2 husbands, raised 2 children, helped build a successful ranch, and lived to see her grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. But more than any of those accomplishments, she'd learned the most important lesson of her life when she was 42 years old and a lonely widow, that it was never too late to be seen, to be valued, to be loved. She thought often of Lucas, especially in the quiet moments when the ranch settled into evening, and she sat alone on the porch they'd shared for so many years. She could almost feel his presence beside her, could almost hear his voice saying those words that had changed everything. "You're exactly what I prayed for." And she smiled, knowing that she'd been blessed beyond measure, not despite her age but because of it. Because she'd lived long enough to know who she was, strong enough to weather life's storms, brave enough to open her heart one more time when everyone told her she was too old for such foolishness. Zelda Gardner Edmund passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1923 at the age of 82, surrounded by the family she and Lucas had created. At her funeral, Rose spoke of her mother's courage and strength, of how she'd refused to let society's expectations dictate her happiness. Thomas spoke of the love between his parents, how it had been the foundation of everything good in his life. And in the valley where she'd lived and loved and built a life, people remembered her not as the widow who'd been laughed at for her age, but as the woman who'd proven that love and happiness knew no age limits. She became a legend of sorts, a reminder that it was never too late to begin again, never too late to find joy, never too late to be exactly who you were meant to be. The ranch she and Lucas built together remained in the family for generations, a testament to their hard work and dedication. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the Montana grasslands, turning everything golden, people said you could almost see them there on the porch. Two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd loved each other through all challenges, who'd proven that the best things in life often come when you least expect them, and have the courage to reach for them anyway. Their story lived on, passed down through the family, a reminder that love is always worth the risk, that happiness is always worth pursuing, and that you are never too old to be exactly what someone has been praying for. In a world that too often values youth above wisdom, beauty above character, and shallow charm above deep connection, Lucas and Zelda's love stood as proof that real love sees beyond the surface to the soul underneath, and that when two people find that kind of love, it can transform not just their own lives but the lives of everyone around them for generations to come.